So our final full item is the zero carbon submission, and warm welcome, John, Chief Sustainability Officer, and Sarah. We've got a presentation and a thing. Is this on here?
It is, yes.
I don't need paper then.
Fantastic.
Councillor Cooper, you win the vote for the most sustainable councillor around this table.
It was a test. It was a test.
You.
Kia ora koutou o te tia mana, tēnā koutou ngā mema komiti. Ko John Morrow Takangoa, and I'm here to talk about the zero carbon bill submission with Sarah Anderson and the team. Slam dunk for climate change, really. We'll take the report as read, but just a few slides to give you some context and to make a connection to something you participated in last week. Oops. So just a quick highlight of, if there's one slide to get you up to speed with what the zero carbon bill is, this is it. Basically, it sets the policy architecture for our transition to a low emissions or even zero emissions climate resilient New Zealand. It provides stability, transparency, and long-term certainty to all sectors, and it creates pathways to get there without leaving people behind. The specifics of the bill and that the submission addresses are a new 2050 target, emissions target, and associated budgets, as well as establishing a new independent climate commission to guide this transition over the next several decades. It also considers climate adaptation as part of the package. Great. You might remember a similar conversation just from last week that we had, because we did actually talk a little bit about the zero carbon bill there. And we had, with most of the folks in the room actually, we had a really good conversation about the vision for Auckland as it relates to the zero carbon bill and as it relates to our vision for a city that's climate proof. And these are the things that we heard. We heard a lot more than this, and we're typing it up and we're analyzing it. But these are some of the themes that came through directly from you from that workshop. Including the bottom, which was a pretty salient comment about incorporating the purpose of this bill into our approach locally with Auckland. There are 6 points in the submission. If you've read the paper, you know that. I'll just quickly go through each of them. One is we support, in our draft submission, a zero emissions target for all greenhouse gas emissions. I can unpack that a little bit at sort of near the end before discussion. We also state a preference for domestic reductions, the reason being we get the benefits, the co-benefits here locally instead of purchasing them offshore. The third point is we support budget cycles, so there's predictability over time. Those have been proposed at 5-year cycles, and that seems appropriate. The fourth is the establishment of a commission. And you'll note a nice parallel to the approach we're taking here in Auckland, where we, both Mayor Goff and Councillor Holtz, invited an independent commission to check and challenge our work as we develop in Auckland's climate action plan. We also support including adaptation in the bill, much to the conversation we had with you at the workshop. Doing them together makes things less confusing and actually creates a whole host of opportunities for multiple outcomes from one spend or one intervention. And then we also provide some additional advice to consider land use and planning policy, think about the just transition, partnership with Tangata Whenua, and actually supporting local governments to make this transition as well. Just to quickly highlight, we've been doing some good work in this space, and not just the folks in my team who have been doing a fantastic job leading this. It's really been all hands on deck from council. You'll see our working group includes quite a few folks who are regularly here at this committee. It also includes a group of others we pulled in, not expressly as part of the working group, but the ICT team and ATEED and TSI and community facilities and parks. And then a whole host of engagement and collaboration and even co-design with Mana Whenua through the Kaitiaki Forum, with central government through an agreed relationship on how we're going to do this together, through local boards, of which we visited 19 last month with independent workshops with each, with the private sector, conversations with various leadership and groups in the private industry, with advisory boards that we're cycling through right now, and a great collaboration in the sort of ethos of this down at Grid AKL with Innovate Auckland, Of course, I just mentioned as well the Independent Advisory Group, and then a variety of stakeholder and community groups we'll be actually working with over the course of the next couple months. So I'm just trying to paint the picture here that this zero carbon bill, you can sort of see the timeline for the bill at the bottom, and you can see the timeline for our own action plan. And a little bit by quirk, but a little bit by design, we're trying to do our best to sync these things together. That gives you a sense of the timeline. It's a pretty aggressive timeline on both our parts, really with a bill in force by April, as well as our own plan adopted by this committee. I will just add a few other bits and pieces based on the first issue, which is the targets, if that's appropriate. I'm sort of deferring to the chair here. Is that so? This is a conversation being held across New Zealand right now, and suffice to say, we don't know what the result of the submission period is going to look, but we've been hearing quite a bit of support for the first, our submission and the target that we're proposing, which is all greenhouse gases. And the reason being, I think there's sort of many layers to this, but the quick reason for that is that as a country, with the last government, we made a commitment in Paris to join our Pacific neighbors and friends as part of the High Ambition Coalition to get to a maximum of 1.5 degrees temperature rise. And in doing so, we really set ourselves on an ambitious trajectory to playing our part and realizing that you know, what we do here locally matters on the global stage. So the all greenhouse gases is probably the most ambitious target, although the modeling from NZIER illustrates that it's the same amount of GDP impact as the middle target. And it also allows us to both lead with some pragmatism, because instead of trying to solve a problem at the next half of the next century, we're actually saying now we don't have the answers, but we know where we want to go, and therefore by stating that explicitly in the bill, we'll actually provide the levers, the incentives, and the support for some industries like agriculture, for instance, to get there with us. And I think our analysis is that deferring that decision or sort of downgrading that to a stabilization of methane, for instance, won't actually put in place the levers that we need to actually transition our industry and stay competitive globally. I'll stop there.
Okay. So I know, and councillors and members, we're on page 101 is that key block that we're talking about, and this is the net zero carbon dioxide by 2050, net zero long-lived gases and stabilised short-term gases by 2050, or net zero emissions by 2050, which is the recommended approach. And this is the one where there probably is the most discussion. It's a bit of a rural-urban issue, and I just want to ask the Mayor, who's raised some of this quite wisely, and open it up for discussion. Mayor Phil.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, John and Sarah, for a paper. I think the paper overall is really good. I do have some queries, however, about the recommendation in item 1 dealing with the 2050 emission target, which you've just referred to. Council until now, as I understand it, has gone for the middle option, which is the net zero long-lived gases and the stabilised short-term gases. The short-term gases last about 12 years, the long-term for hundreds of years. So a lot of people around the world are separating those two. And why I raise the question is because I know Jeanette Fitzsimons, who's well known around this table as a strong climate change activist to do everything that we should do, actually doesn't support the net zero emissions across all gases. She supports separating short-term gases from long-term, and the reason that she does that is partly because of the impact of short-term gases, partly because we can still achieve our goal of zero emissions with the middle option, but she thinks that the net emissions across all gases will be really difficult and put incredible pressure on farmers. And interestingly, Gen Zero is another group that is supportive of separating reducing the short-term gases from the long-term gases. And I've got a couple of questions arising out of that. One, I'm curious that we're going beyond two groups that would be regarded as amongst the strongest advocates for doing everything we need to on climate change. Secondly, I wonder, you mentioned, John, in your comments that you want to get agriculture there with us. Has this been discussed with our Rural Advisory Panel? Because if it hasn't, I think we've got a problem. It's going to be really important to them, and they need to have been part of the discussion at this point. And the third thing is, I wonder just how much you have analysed the impact on them, and whether they can realise that without without an extraordinary impact on them. I've always supported bringing agriculture in. I did in government, and I do now. But I'm wondering whether we're going a step too far, and whether it might not be better to go for the most achievable, the doable, that achieves the zero carbon emissions, and then expand if we can, rather than setting an ambition that takes us beyond what might be achieved and then have to come back from that. My preference would be to go as far as you can and then expand further if you're able. And my feeling very strongly is that, you know, as you used the term, we need to carry this sector with us, and I'm not sure that this recommendation will carry that sector with us. So perhaps if you could comment on some of those points.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through the chair. You raised some great points. So look, I'll try to scribble down each of them, and I'll try to get to them. And if I don't remember them all, then I'm sure
I'll remind
Sarah
you.
will, and you can remind me. So look, I mean, this wasn't something I think we took lightly, and obviously this is just a recommendation, and we'll ultimately do what the committee, you know, wants to endorse. It's fine with us. The difference here is I think short-term gases is perhaps a misnomer, because I think there are some gases that actually stick around for a long time. And stabilizing those gases won't actually have much of an impact on reducing our impact in global warming. It'll just hold the line. We're not asking for, or this bill is not asking for, a rapid transition to net zero in even a decade. And I think the point that we're trying to make here is that if we know where we want to go, which actually in our analysis is that agriculture is with us, that we are producers of net zero you know, agricultural products as a country, we've got a global edge there. Stating that commitment up front allows us to get on board faster and to provide some urgency for the transformation we need. So things like incentives, things like innovation are driven by that urgency. And I think if we do put this off, it'll allow us a little bit more time to kind of come up with an answer, but we'll come up with the same answer after perhaps other countries have, and there might be a competitive disadvantage there. So that fed a little bit into our thinking. I think your point about it being really difficult, hey, let's not mince words here. Either one's going to be really difficult. Let's just be honest. This is pretty big scale transition, and luckily the whole point of the bill is to say, we know what we need to do. It's going to take a long time. It's going to be hard. Let's set some transparency and predictability for that change. On the Rural Advisory Panel, we've been to the Rural Advisory Panel at least once, it might be twice, to talk specifically about the impacts of climate change to the sector. I wasn't at those meetings, but from what I can tell, I think Sarah was. There were some pretty salient comments made and some great agreement on action in the space. We didn't unpack the zero carbon bill explicitly, from what I understand, because that wasn't the purpose of it. It was talk about Auckland's transition. But we can go back and do that and keep engaging the Rural Advisory Panel and the sector in this conversation. We simply have to. I'm going to just pass it in case there are things I'm forgetting or questions that you've raised, Mr. Mayor, that I'm neglecting. Make sure.
I can briefly, we went to the Rural Advisory Panel recently on the Climate Action Plan to gather their thoughts and what their priorities were. And that actually was last week, I think. No, it was a bit longer ago. So as John said, we didn't unpack this issue in particular, but we spoke a lot around what mitigation and adaptation looked like. And the Rural Advisory Panel had a very strong focus on adaptation and serious concerns about what climate change actually means for the sector. And so that was very much the focus of the discussions, less so than the emissions particularly. But as John said, we can go back, or we are going back as we progress the Climate Action Plan.
I've also been in touch with a number of cities in this space. LG&Z has a working group, and they're going to be providing a submission as well. And you know, I'm just one of many voices at that table suggesting what the position should be. But I think the sense I get is that I think worried might be putting it a little bit too far. If we're lagging behind other cities making a statement about, you know, a full nuclear-free movement instead of sort of almost there, It's a bit of a reputational vulnerability for us, if I could just be honest. And I think it would stand in great synergy with what we've said on the global stage and actually what we said locally, partly through your leadership, Mr. Mayor, and what you've endorsed and declared as part of our C40 agreement.
If I can ask a supplementary, look, there are a couple of things lagging behind other cities, so I don't know whether the other cities you're comparing us to are 80% rural, but we are. They are a significant part of our area. The Rural Advisory Committee is surprisingly positive and constructive, but if we haven't raised this specific option with them, they are going to feel like they have been left out of the loop and ignored. And like my colleague Councillor Casey, I put a big emphasis on our advisory panels. If we don't take them seriously, we don't involve them in the conversation, they are going to feel redundant. And we're talking about a submission that's going forward now, but we haven't actually raised this particular issue with them. The second thing that I probably, the short-term gases, my understanding, methane, nitrous oxide are the main gases that come out of ruminant animals. Correct me, I might be wrong, I'm not a scientist, but I understood that they were short-life gases. 12 years is what I was told. The third thing is, I think we really need, either option is actually is an ambitious option. We've moved a long way. Both will achieve zero, but one at a slightly higher temperature. But what I'm really keen to do is make sure that what we're going for is doable, achievable, and not something that we start down the track, we have a shit fight over it, to use the French term, and then have to back down. I would rather do it the other way. Have we really analysed the doability of this and the impact on the agricultural sector? And if we haven't, then we should go for the ambitious but not quite so far target rather than the other way around. We've done all the work and you're absolutely satisfied, it's doable and it's not going to totally smash the agricultural sector, fine. But I don't have the feeling that we've done all of that work and we can be confident about that.
So through the chair, if I might just quickly respond, it sounds like there's a strong alignment here with what our intended approach here in the development of our local plan is. So that's quite connected to this submission, but we had a limited amount of time to both receive and respond to the submission, coordinate across the CCOs and across the council family. So I think if we had more time, having this conversation more broadly would have been desirable. I think perhaps two things. One is that nationally the conversation from the agricultural sector has been, if I could say, surprisingly positive in their support for net zero emissions. It's not across the board, there are multiple voices and I can't represent kind of a synthesis of all of them, but I think suffice to say the minister maybe himself was taken aback by the level of support from the sector, which to me I think underscores the rationale behind our approach. And of course we could do more analysis and perhaps we should, so I really appreciate the steer. What we're trying to do is make sure that sectors like agriculture have what they need and the urgency they need in comparison to the other sectors to make the transition and to do so with grace and without serious disruption. So conversations have been had, they have not been thorough. That's not necessarily our role, it's still out for submission. Government's coming back actually to do a zero carbon bill event in Monaco on Thursday. It's another opportunity to have your say. They did one here before that we supported and coordinated with them. So points all taken. It depends on how detailed we want to do the analysis on the impact to our own sector, of which the emissions are relatively small compared to things like transport.
Let's take some other comments and then we'll work out the way forward.
Sorry, and sorry, may I add one more thing through the chair? I was just made aware by the quiet genius in the back in my team that actually nitrous oxide and nitrogen has about 114-year life in the atmosphere. So methane, you're absolutely correct, Mr. Mayor, that is 12 years. But there are other components that actually have a longer life, so hence a little bit of concern there. Sorry.
Okay, good clarification. I've got Member Brown, Councillor Newman, Sayers and Darby. Member Brown.
Kia ora. wanted to maybe, in a question endpoint sense, and for me at least, I'm talking from a coastal environment that's under duress, that's on limited time of occupancy, notwithstanding the single largest ice shelf has just broken off in the Antarctic, from which the inevitable consequences are further duress on my village on the foreshore. So notwithstanding whether gases are short or long term, which industries or communities are either indirectly or directly affected shows over, quite frankly, and has been for some time. I want to pick up on a couple of comments you made around the momentum shift within the industry. You call that a generational shift from the traditional operator to the new operator, who's a lot more environmentally informed and aware and responsible. I am part of the community that the Mayor has referred to. I am a current farmer in the rural district of the region, and freely, without hesitation, commit at least our property and asset to this journey. But nothing other than the shelf has broken, the water is rising, the gas is compressing the oxygen we breathe. It's inevitable. So I'm not here with respect to myself as a farmer defecting one industry or defending one against the other. I support the Mayor's view around there should have been communications with that sector. I have an assumption that as members of Federated Farmers, they're already committed to a bill submission of sorts. But the question I have for you was, to make it easy for our community to understand, have you unpacked it from the end point back around the real science that doesn't need debating, like water level rise because of the effects of gas on the Antarctic? Because this conversation of short and long term does nothing for the greater solution of what's still facing the world. And in our case, because of gas and other things, it's sea level rise. So, yeah, I mean, that for me makes it an easy understand for our community around why is it that we're facing these matters that we've never faced, arguably, in the way we have at the moment. So have you got that stuff at the ready insofar as a submission?
So through the chair, I think at least one thing worth mentioning is that we've taken this committee through a bit of a journey through what those impacts will look like for Auckland, and that underpins our work locally. So we commissioned across all the main 4 CCOs, the district health boards, and numerous units in council, an analysis through NIWA of what those impacts will be specifically for our communities in Auckland. And that should, and there are 2 scenarios, and there's I could send that around again. It was a piece of work that Sarah led and can speak more to the detail. But that gave us a clear understanding of what's to come in terms of temperature, soil moisture, rainfall frequency, sea level rise, and a number of other indicators. It's not the truth. It's a modeled set of outputs, but it actually makes it real for Auckland and not just a sort of New Zealand, national context. We're using that as the base right now to do a risk and vulnerability assessment for the region that has a number of lenses: economic, social, environmental, and we would be foolish not to think about impacts on industry. And so we are looking at the economic angle, and this is work being led by REMU, I should make note, that builds off that NEWA work. So long story short, evidence is being pulled together to be able to put ourselves on a path to make the decisions and take the actions based on that evidence. I think that was to your point. What do we know?
Just a supplementary. So we know a financial loss that we inevitably are facing right now. We've just constructed a $7 million asset called Almanai. We've got less than 20 years life, current location, before we have to pick it up and move it. So that was like a year ago. As recent as a month ago with our meeting with NIWA, that could be as less as 12 years before we move. Cool.
Thanks, Mr. Morrow. What cities are you referring to beyond Auckland?
At this point, because the submission from LGNZ has not been finalized, it's hard to say, but one might say that they are a number of larger population cities in the country.
Which ones? Can you name
I guess I don't want to infer that there's been a decision by that group, because ultimately it's
them?
LGNZ's.
I'm not asking about the decision. You're referring to, you referenced cities.
Yeah.
And I'd like to, because I think the Mayor's absolutely right, 80% of Auckland is rural, so I'm wanting to try and understand who we're talking about alongside us.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just a little bit unclear with the question. So is that cities that are supporting more widely, or cities that have unpacked and are dealing with the issue of the short-lived gases versus
The reference, I'm really trying to understand the remarks that were made in relation to cities other than Auckland, which was what was reported by the staff. I've got some follow-ups, but I'm just wanting to see if we can understand which of those other cities he's referring to.
Because just to be clear, so most of the cities, all the metros have certainly signed up to, the mayors have all signed the commitment to the climate change, LGNZ climate change plan, which is fairly comprehensive.
I'm not sure if any of those other cities have 80% rural coverage.
No, so I might suggest that I could pull that list who have signed the declaration, and then once the submission from LGNZ is finalized, forward those cities off to you, if that would be helpful. I think the other thing worth noting is that as a country, we are 80% urban. If you think about where people live, not spatially, it just depends on how you slice it. So to some degree, the urbanization of our country, for Auckland, for instance, requires a set of solutions that are quite different than the rest of the country. And for instance, transport. It's not a nationally, it's what, 18%, or just checking my back here, something like that in terms of national emissions, but it's really our core emission for a city. So our solution set will be quite a bit different than the national solution set.
I agree with you. So with respect to that, you referred to the incentives and innovation which will need to be considered to get agriculture on board, using your words. So what would be the form of those incentives that you're referring to?
I think it'd be unwise for me to comment on that. I think mainly because central government needs to do a lot of work what this looks like on a national scale. And so their intent of putting this out early, getting submission on the vision and where we're going, is so that they can set in place certainty and predictability, and then start talking about the tool sets. Now, we're on record of supporting a number of incentives, from things like healthy homes to thinking about policy levers in transport and waste, disincentives. There's a number of things that have come through this committee that we've put in submissions, and I'm also happy to forward that along to you as well.
But nothing in agriculture?
I believe from memory we've taken the position that agriculture should be included in the New Zealand emissions trading scheme.
There's no offsets.
Sorry?
Okay. All right, I'm just going to leave it there, Chair.
Okay. Happy to follow up at any point, Councillor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank the Mayor just for raising those concerns around the rural sector and the non-involvement, because they were the comments that I was going to make. So I endorse what the Mayor's said there. It's a bit, I couldn't really support this without, in the vacuum that it's sitting in with that rural advisory panel. I mean, it just met on Friday. I chaired it. The Mayor spent a terrific amount of time with us, and it was very much appreciated. So there is a concern in my mind on behalf of that rural sector. Unfortunately, Bill's not here today, but just that they used the word unpacked with them, but I'd say fully brought up to speed and have the ability to actually input into this. That's just not there at the moment. And I've heard what you've been saying around that, but I just think
So we've got a few options. I know we've got Councillor Darby, who's the last person to speak. If the meeting is of a mind, it's fine to amend the recommendations. We can move. I think people understand the issue here. It's only one issue that there is disagreement on. It's actually moving from the one option to the other option. And I think that's probably where we need to make our minds up. I'll let Councillor Darby speak and then we'll try and bring this together.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I'm probably more on the net zero emissions camp at this stage, but John, can we just unpack long life, short life gases and what's in that category? We've got carbon dioxide, we've got nitrous oxide, we've got methane, and we've got the fluorinated gases.
Bad stuff.
Can we just go through those gases, look at the contributions to the nation's greenhouse gas emissions and the cities, our city's greenhouse gas emissions? I think we need to do a little Gas 101 lesson here to understand what it all means.
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor. I wish I was that good to be able to take you through that in 30 seconds. Top of mind, I cannot. So I could either kind of run through it looking behind me at someone who might have a bit more technical expertise, or we can come back with a one-pager comparison to this committee in the next 24 hours, whatever. It's hard for me to understand.
Yeah.
We've explained in the submission short and long term. It's actually in the government submission document, discussion document. Just trying to think of
We produce nationally and citywide. Methane also. There is methane production, not just in the rural sector, but also in the urban, Auckland. It's through manufacturing processes and burning of some fuels. The fluorinated, I think we can take it as a given, are really dangerous. And they have long lives. Fluorinated gases have long lives. Am I correct in that regard? Very long lives?
Thousands of years, yeah.
And nitrous oxide, I think it's broadly accepted that nitrous oxide is long and dangerous. So
And with higher potency as well, like as nitrous oxide's got, I've forgotten the potency of that. But like methane is around 1 to 16 times the CO2. So it's, you got to think about, it's not just purely methane versus CO2, it's
exactly.
the level of being poisonous, basically.
Right. So the question, Chair, is around methane. That's what I'm hearing it here today. And we're 80% rural, so we need to consult the Urban Advisory Panel. And isn't there a process through the Select Committee, the hearings? Isn't there that opportunity to socialise that? Is this not an opportunity for this council to show some leadership in this area so that we can actually start to spawn this discussion? I'm just wondering whether this is about kicking the can down the road for somewhere and somebody else, or we actually step up. I want your view on that, because I'm quite concerned about kicking the can down the road.
Can I just highlight one more point here is our agriculture emissions for Auckland is only 6%. So even though we are 80% rural, the emissions low, that means the productivity of the agricultural products, it sits outside Auckland. And 90% on the urban forest as well. 90% of our population sits in the urban context. So we are quite urbanized. And that 6% I find interesting, that I know 80% we're rural, but there's only 6% of emissions come from agriculture. So our views should align with that as well.
And I understand that.
Yep.
We're just a city region. We've got a lot of rural land, but we've got a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I can see, and this is a really big issue, and this portion of it is very complex, and it boils down to, do we want to bravely lead at the leading edge, or do we want to, which is equally valid, look at a leadership role as a half urban, half rural council. And I don't think, and I'm just looking around me, I don't think we've quite landed this. So we've got two ways we can go forward with this. We have lunch ready at 12:30 over the other side at Albert Street, and then we are going straight into a very brief briefing / workshop just on where we've got to with recycling and waste, because you'll know there's an awful lot going on with the sort of changes happening internationally. It does give our staff a little bit of time to do a bit of a which I think for me would be really useful, a bit of a pie diagram that breaks down the short-term, long-term gases, the components in our, just roughly, not a huge piece of research, but, what is it that we're talking about? We just need to grapple and quantify this, and I wonder if at the end of our briefing on waste we could come back to this issue. My sense is that the rest of the submission people are happy with, and it may be that if people are comfortable that we sign off we endorse the zero carbon emission in the body of this report. However, the minor revisions that the chair, deputy chair, who isn't here, Independent Māori Statutory Board, make minor revisions in consultation with I was going to say the members of the committee, help me here, guys. I'm losing my words, it's been a long day. What I'm trying to do is to say, how do we actually just come back, team, have a look at the detail and finalise this one solution with this one component of it, without trying to do it all now, because I'm just aware that we are way past the time when we had said we would finish this.
What about
Yeah.
Chair, I'm not sure that you're going to be able to broker a consensus. One of the options may be is that there is a minority position. If a minority position was appended to this submission, because I'm not going to vote for it, and I don't think you'll be able to wordsmith it in a way that's going to get me over the line. But if the majority support this, then that's the position. And I think that the only sort of comfort that those of us who are potentially in the minority can take is that it would be helpful if that vote in opposition could be reflected in the reason why, being that you append something additional to that.
I mean, I'm really comfortable, and Dean and I just had that discussion, that we endorse the carbon bill submission as is. However, we note clearly that on on either minority, majority, that there isn't agreement around the council table for option 2 versus option 3, and that X number of councillors voted for option 2 and X number of councillors voted for option 3. The reasons being our large rural hinterland and the fact that we didn't feel that this had been sufficiently consulted with the rural sector. And maybe that's simple. I think people are getting tired. I'm happy to go either way. Come back in a couple of hours, finish off this bit, or simply move the recommendation, noting that X number of members voted for the one option, X number of people voted for the other option. I'm agnostic where that lands up.
If it's helpful, Madam Chair, I probably would support what Councillor Newman said.
That's what we're saying, but we just will need to get to the vote. Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, I'm kind of reluctant. This is about a submission to a select committee, and if you make a submission and you say, well, we're half and half or whatever, you reduce the impact. Look, let me get it absolutely clear. I am absolutely in favour of a leadership role on reducing emissions into the environment and dealing with climate change. What I really worry about is process, that there's a significant advisory panel that we haven't talked the specifics about, and this is the representative of the group that will be overwhelmingly affected by our decision. So I think our process is really bad for our advisory committees. The second thing is, the rural communities come a long way. I want the rural community to be in with the emissions scheme. Either way, these two options take us down to zero emissions by 2050, which is our key goal. But one does it at a slightly higher temperature at that point. But what makes me reluctant is that I don't know yet what the impact on that sector will be, and I'm reluctant to make a decision where I don't know what the impact is and whether it's doable. That is my bottom line. I have never made decisions on the basis that I really don't know what the impact will be. And I've got to go back to the Rural Advisory Committee and to those of our people in Rodney and in Franklin and say, we made this decision, but we don't know what the impact on you is going to be. I don't think that's a sustainable position. That's why, if I was to make a recommendation, it would be to go for 2. But you can, if you want, say, we are happy to explore the other if a satisfactory way can be made that the agricultural sector can make this adaptation. But I'm not prepared to be black and white and say they need to do it without knowing whether that actually decimates them in the process. And I don't know the answer to that question. That's a genuine point.
So, because it's a submission, and thank God we're not the final decision makers on this, we're simply talking to the government who are, why don't we say that then?
Yep.
Why don't we just say that? Why don't we just say that? So, you know, if, Mr Mayor, you're wanting to put in, I've now lost the dot between 3 and 2.
Yeah, the nuance is slightly different. I'd say go for 2 and then ask the government if they can go beyond that, having regard for whether it's doable and what the impact might be, rather than say go for the full Monty, even though we don't know what the thing is, and then pull back if we can't do it. I just think our traditional position as a council, right up till this submission, has been number 2, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Say, let's go with this and let's see if you can go further, but on the basis of an investigation on whether it is doable and how that impact might be mitigated for the farmers. Is that a good compromise?
Okay. So what we're doing is we are endorsing the submission. We are putting 2 in there based on option 2 with that requirement for...
Can we go further?
Slightly more inspirational...
you mean option 2 in decision-making point 1?
Yep.
Yeah.
Option 2 in decision-making point 1. And the narrative will explain our reasons for that. That's what you're proposing?
Yeah, and I just add this one thing. You know, generally I would line up with Gen Zero, which I do on this issue, and somebody like Jeanette Fitzsimons. So we're not putting ourselves in a conservative position. Oh, no. We're putting ourselves in the position with 2 groups, or an individual and a group, that generally we would be supportive of in this context.
Okay, all right.
Do we
That's
have
what
to
the
do
Mayor's
this now?
proposing. I've got Councillor Hills and Councillor Simpson.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm a bit concerned that this sort of feels like it's come up and we're just doing it ad hoc, and it's also a submission. It's not our plan. The other thing is we're talking about the Rural Advisory Panel. Are we going to talk to the Pacific Peoples Panel about the fact that their islands are being flooded? Are we going to talk about to the Youth Advisory Panel the fact that their grandkids are going to have serious damage to their communities and homes? So are we just focusing on one advisory panel? Like what? I'm just a bit worried that... Well, I just... Yeah,
it is the advisory panel that is most affected by this proposal, and we need to have talked to them.
Well, I would argue the Pacific Peoples Panel is most affected, the Youth Advisory Panel is most affected. So we're all most affected in different ways.
Okay,
so
all right.
we talk...
Point made.
I'm just a bit concerned that when we're looking at the issues we've seen earlier today, and that was about environment over economic, and now we're talking about economic over environment in this decision. But yeah, I just wish we were able to talk about this a bit before we got to the meeting rather than an ad hoc kind of... Yeah. To me, this feels like a surprise.
This was raised, yes, this did come up last night, so it is a new... It's an alternative viewpoint, but I guess no different than, you know, new viewpoints come up around this table. You know, our choice is to support that recommendation, and if not, we go back to, you know, the voting on option 3. So, Councillor Simpson.
Madam Chair, I'm nervous. I don't think anybody in the room doesn't buy into doing something to help carbon emissions, but the process has been flawed. Do we have to do it today?
Well, that's why I was hoping we could either take a little bit of time to do it this afternoon. We do, what's on Thursday?
Could we adjourn the meeting?
Sorry, what's the deadline for submissions is
Yeah.
probably what we need to
19th
know.
of July.
It's the 19th.
So we have to get the submission in.
We could do it on Thursday. What is on Thursday?
Sports facilities investment plan?
Yeah.
Working party or?
There's not a, because unfortunately, the complication being we're in recess next week, so.
Thursday?
MSB.
No,
Okay, no,
Thursday.
sorry, we're just trying
It's
to
just I'm being practical. It's not my experience that councillors come to meetings that are not on a day when there's an official council meeting. So if we're going to reconvene, the committee would need to come back together.
Okay.
That's why I thought that if there's time to do just a little bit of discussion, there's nothing wrong with us reconvening post the workshop.
I agree.
Would we
Let's do that.
If we have a
We could
quorum.
do it over there.
We could
If
do
we've
it
got a-
over
Do that.
there. So
I
there is
support
the
that.
ability for us to break. I think everyone's a bit tired. Have a break,
I support that.
have the workshop. We've got staff waiting over there for a 1 o'clock workshop,
Let's do that.
Meantime, are you?
but we will
Well,
need
can we
a
have
quorum.
lunch first, or do
So,
we have to do a workshop first?
no, we can do both.
Not a matter
Can
of
I
speed,
just
but
check,
social.
if that is the decision that's made, I need 11 people to be present. So I need 10 people to put their hands up right
If you
now.
come, but I'll still
Who
be
can
voting
still
no.
be there?
Yeah, we're-
1, 2,
We have to do
3,
it now.
4, 5, 6, 7. So there's no point in resuming this
Keep going.
afternoon.
Okay.
Okay.
Madam Chair, oh,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I mean, normally if people don't agree, they just vote against.
That's indeed
Rather
the
than
option.
having to, because
We'll have a
at
division.
the end of the day, if you can't reconvene, you can't get a consensus anyway, so.
We were having a go.
Yeah, no, I know,
And-
you were very good like
We
that.
were doing our best, and it might well be that that's not going to be a happening thing. Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Look, it's not moved or seconded yet, so some discussion. It does disturb me that we are reliant on the input of one advisory panel, and Councillor Hills, the youngest out of the councillors here, points out that this is not a problem of agriculture. If you really want to hang your hat on one advisory panel, I'd probably be seeking the youth advisory panel input here. They are representative, maybe, of those that are going to be living the longest through this problem. And I am still concerned that we in some ways it's a bit like the Waitakare's situation that we faced some months ago, you know, where we decided to close a few tracks and leave many open. And we ultimately arrived at the need to close all the tracks. It took us a while to get there, but we probably knew at the outset that we needed to close all the tracks. But we took the conservative view. And we just cannot afford to take the conservative view here. Look, we're not actually, don't have it moved. I have a concern about this stabilised short-term gases. John, if you stabilise those short-term gases, don't they work together? The short-term gases work with the long-term gases. So you could have success or failure with your long-term gases and success or failure with your short-term gases. You really need to be looking at them holistically. You can't isolate them. Well, that's my view. That's my reading of it. Generation Zero, in fact, I probably disagree with Generation Zero because they don't understand the correlation between the short and long term. My understanding is their submission is about sustainability of the short-term gases. Can you just explain this correlation of the gases? Because I don't think we're getting the importance of it here.
So we are prepared, so through the chair, we are prepared to do a bit of a gas 101. That's probably the last thing you want to do before lunch. However, I did actually just call up Gen Zero's suggested submission, and it's a little bit confusing. If I could just put out there, they're supporting the most ambitious target of reducing total greenhouse gases, but then they actually go in and sort of unpack the difference between short and long term. So it's not totally lucid, if I could just be honest in my own analysis of it. What we are talking about here is potency, and that each gas has its own set of characteristics. And I guess from a broad, general point of view, while it's important to think about each sector, each advisory panel, each gas, and what we need to do to get to where we want to go, if we don't take a holistic approach, there could be some disbenefits in leaving bits out. And I think what I was trying to say up front was, if we take an all-sector, all-economy approach, which actually NZIER modeled, you know, and if we could, it's in the zero carbon bill discussion document, and they're actually looking at the same GDP growth rate for each of these options. They're looking at per household gross national disposable income being off by, it looks like $1,000, I think, between the two. You know, there's really, in terms of wider economic impacts, from our read, there doesn't seem to be a massive difference in both. What it does give us is some security that we're actually tackling the entire problem and not just the major bit of the problem. We have graphs. Do you want to pull up graphs and go gas by gas? We can do that.
I think there's a much more fundamental issue here that we need to try and resolve as a council. And I think it is unfortunate that this is sort of, you know, trying to do this at the last minute.
Yeah.
And, you know, my chair's intuition is often to go back to what is the, you know, what's in the report, what is the basis for decision making, and what is the council position, and then have we had enough information to dissuade us from that, and are the committee feeling well informed enough to branch out from there. The Mayor's made a very impassioned and well thought through plea for us to include the rural sector and consideration of the rural sector into our decision making. However, the submission as it's presented to us may well sit as a singular submission with one part based on the whole. So I guess we need to just find a way to simply vote on this. I think this is probably the best approach. And Mr. Mayor, you're wanting to move?
Yeah,
option
Madam Chair,
two?
I'll move, just so, I think we've probably got as much information as we can at the moment. I support this submission overall, and I will support, what I want to move is that option 2 be the option, with the nuance that if it can be extended further, we will. If that fails, I'll vote for the submission as a whole. Others may not, but if that makes it easy just to have the vote, and it is about process for me. I don't want to go back to the Rural Advisory Committee and say this was intimately going to have impact on you, and we didn't talk to you about the specific detail. I just think that's bad from the viewpoint of our advisory panels. You know, I think I've made that point. Either way, it is only a submission, guys. So it's
stage one. It's got heaps
yeah,
of time to
it's going to be judged by government, and the government will be forced to look at some of those aspects about whether it's doable. So we shouldn't get too hung up about it.
Okay, so it's been moved. Do I have a seconder for the Mayor's recommendation?
I'll second it, Madam Chair. Just a
You're happy
quick
to
notice
second?
is the fact that we often get caught with short timeframes with submissions to the government. This is not new, and I don't think we should be blaming, you know, the process, because the staff, there's probably, how many of you working on this? Not many. They've been to 19 local boards in the short time frame.
Yeah.
I think they've got a really, you know, they've canvassed the whole region basically, and I think it's really difficult. You can never do this, plan this for 3 or 4 months, 5 months in advance, because we get short notice. So I think we have to work with what we've got, and I think we do need to bring the rural sector into this, and I think that probably with the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor both living in the rural area, they understand that and can well speak for the rural area. So, you know, even if we didn't have time, and we know it's recess week next week, there won't be any local, time to consult with the advisory panels, but I guess that's just noting next time if we have submissions that we tease out which are probably the advisory panels that might be the most pertinent for a particular subject, and making sure we go and talk to them. So I'm happy to move it, Madam Chair, because I know that we've got no time next week, no ability next week, and very short time this week. And I don't think we'll get everybody to agree in the short
Yep.
time frame, but I think it is only a submission.
Done.
Yep.
The government will do with it what it will.
Yep.
Okay,
Exactly.
we may have gone as far as we can. Well, I've got Member Brown and Councillor
Yeah, I do
Newman.
wanna
Do
say
you
a
have
quick
something
few
to add?
things.
Member Brown.
Yeah, I do. It's, appreciate it's just a submission, but it's actually a very critical one. Not at all disrespecting everyone's comments. I understand them, and I do concur. However, I did hear a statistic which I was already aware of around the percentage contribution of the current effect generally from this community, the rural, is less or 6% or less. So we're still stuck with the greater
Transport.
perpetrators,
Yep.
ourselves, regardless of the size, at the 94% contribution
Yep.
to the effect, and regardless of what ethnicity or age group. So I almost liken it like it's like this golf thing that we're going to be talking about later on. We're going to, you know, we allow all the screen spaces for half a dozen people.
Easy, Tiger.
So, and this is almost the same sort of argument being put back to me around, for 6% of effect, we're going to potentially, these are my words, dilute the significance of what's before us. And with regard to leadership, the assumption I had when I walked in was we were all leaders, not followers, and not worried about making leadership decisions, because that's why you're here. So the question I had was pondering in my head was, do we actually know if the Rural Advisory Panel has actually prepared its own submission? Is it allowed to? Has it discussed the matter? Because anyone sitting here surprised by the time slot is a little bit deluded around the corridors of what's before you. This bill and this submission has been pending for months, not days and not weeks, but months. So to arrive at the finite critical point of the whole, to at least challenge me and my vote around 6% of effect is simply not cutting it. And I'm not prepared to dilute the critical nature of what's before you and the significance of it by mere worry of one group. No different, right? No different to the, as Councillor Hills mentioned, of other groups that we're not talking about. And don't get me started over the treaty partnership lens to this conversation. So I'm all about the whole, and I'm maintaining that. Kia ora.
Okay. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, I'm probably on the other side of the argument on this, which Member Brown will know. Look, firstly, congratulations to the officers, because don't forget there is no bill. There's a conversation about a bill. Very hard, frankly, to really provide the policy analysis in response to the grist of nothing, which is really what we're dealing with here. There is a conversation that the Minister is leading, there's some targets, but there is actually no legislation against which to properly prosecute an analysis so as to arrive at recommendations. I think that is a reasonable point. I think that Councillor Hills raises a very fair point, that there are wider impacts than just the rural sector. But I do agree with the Mayor that the agricultural sector is significantly affected. I've always been quite keen on trading international carbon credits, because I think it provides scope for offsetting the impact of activities on the environment. I think the problem, Madam Chair, is the economics of this bill affects New Zealand, and it affects New Zealand differently. And I suspect that it will have an impact in terms of these targets if legislated and if we pursue them, will have an impact whereby it will slow economic growth, and that will inevitably hurt poorer communities harder, I suspect, particularly communities such as mine, where we need jobs and we do need industry. And we are, there's a lot of people that I represent who do work in the agricultural sector, and I worry about the resilience of that sector given all the compliance costs that affect it. So, Chair, I hear the argument, but fundamentally, I think that when it is impossible to land the kind of submission that I suspect would be best served if we actually had a bill to submit on. I suspect we'll be able to address this in more detail later. I'm not going to vote for the recommendations because I don't, in principle, support some of the arguments set out in relation to the zero carbon bill that have been put forward by James Shaw. And but when this matter is codified in a bill, it would be a good opportunity if very early on we could have an all-in on that and to properly thrash the arguments out, because at that point we'll have a lot more specificity in which to debate.
That's a good point at which to end. More specificity would be useful all round. I'm actually going to put the recommendation. I think we. Sorry, councillors. I think we.
I do want to say something, please.
Okay. Well, Councillor Hills is first then.
I have a question, and I can't tell the numbers, and I'm not going to try. But if several of us are voting against, we could end up without. We go back to the.
Yep.
Okay. So just briefly, then, I'm just worried we're missing the point about zero emissions. It's net zero emissions. It's not cutting off emissions. It's and the option 3 that I would prefer doesn't talk about cutting the rural sector off. It talks about driving stronger innovation and associated economic opportunities. It talks about major forest planting required, which would help offset some of the rural emissions. And if you look at Auckland, if it's only 6%, the Mayor's Million Trees and other things are going a long way to help that. It's a higher ambition for no domestic impact on the climate. I don't think what we're saying, if we did have option 3, is that the rural sector no longer exists. It talks about how we can all work together better and faster to help reduce the impact of climate change and the emissions. So I think people are thinking we're talking about zero emissions. We're talking about net zero, meaning that we have to increase our other work faster. So yeah, so I'm disappointed, but the rest of the bill was important. The rest of the submission is important. So I'm torn whether to vote for to enable the rest to happen or to abstain because I'm slightly opposed to other bits. So it's a weird space to be in.
We're all in the same space for different reasons.
Yeah.
I'm going to vote against.
Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Chair, and look, thanks for taking the call. Look, I want to acknowledge the contribution of Member Brown. I thought Member Brown's contribution here today was significant, powerful, and more than pertinent. Member Brown raised a lot of points that I echo. In some ways, this item should have been right up the top of the agenda. This should have been item 1 on the agenda before anything else. And Chair, I know you have to struggle with a whole lot of things in the formulation of your agenda, but in the future, I would like to see our work on climate change, the next stages and our submission on this, or anything related to it, to be at the top of the agenda. You know, the World Health Organization say it's the greatest health challenge of our time and probably for the next 100 years.
There was a staff reason that it was down on the agenda. It was to make time for Mr Morrow to be here.
Because, okay, well, I am reflecting on other times where we've actually had to defer to another meeting, and that's occurred. So, look, there might be good reasons, but for me, this is a very important area of our business, and we have to address it. And it's challenging, yes, but there is no good reason for us to reduce our responsibility by suggesting that the Rural Advisory Board has not been consulted fully. I'm aware that there were just cluster workshops with the local boards, given the urgency and the need to get back to the Parliament with our submission from the City of Auckland, the region City of Auckland. I think it's just critical that we stamp our mark right now for this discussion going forward. You know, the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, talked about climate change being our nuclear-free moment. And I was reflecting on that recently and thinking, well, what did she mean by that? And going back to the 1970s when Mayor Gough, I think you came into the Parliament in the early 70s?
80s.
Jeez.
I'm
80s, was it 80s, sorry? I'm just trying to remember the years. But look, that year where we sailed that frigate into, the nuclear testing zone of Mururoa, that was about leadership. That was about leadership. And we were noticed worldwide. People sat up right around the world and noticed that leadership. And I know that that's what the Prime Minister meant. She meant actually doing things that others had not been prepared to do and doing them now. And the G20, they've said this is the greatest challenge of our time. And the list goes on. So, members, I also reflected on Germany about 6 years ago. Merkel, the Chancellor there, just decided that they would get out of nuclear energy. Without a business case, she just announced, with the support of her cabinet equivalent, and I don't know what it's called, that they would get out of nuclear energy. And did they get out of it because of the risk that nuclear energy posed? Yes, they did. But one of the most significant reasons they disclosed later was they wanted to get out of nuclear energy and be the leaders in new energy. And today, the German private sector is the leader in new energies. And they own that IP now. Now imagine if we said that about methane and agriculture and took the lead, like the Germans did and not too many years ago, on nuclear energy, and we, as an agricultural nation, and 6% here in Auckland, contributions to greenhouse gases, but if we became the leaders in new agriculture, you have to take the first bold step, as the Germans did, almost without a business case, to be the owners of new energies in the future, as the Germans are, or the owners of the IP around new agriculture. So I'm asking, I'm not going to be supporting A. It's going to be hard for me if that is passed and my name is not in support of that submission on the bill outright. But I am going to be supporting the officer's recommendation as in the paper outright. I think we cannot kick it down the road any longer. So this won't have my vote of support. That's difficult, but I'm hopeful that the A actually fails and that we adopt and send to the Parliament the submission as it is outlined by our staff, our specialist staff, and their recommendations in full. My hope is that we back their recommendations in full.
That's as good a moment as any to put the recommendations. We tried everything we could to have a little bit more time to work this through, but I think we need to deal with them. So I'll put the recommendations. Or actually, do you want to do it by division?
No.
Do you want to just do it? All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against?
No.
I think the noes have it. Back to the next one. So we'll go back to the original one.
Take a division on that.
And I will put that, or you want a division on this one?
I will have a division on the primary.
Okay. Right. Well, let's do this one by division. Give it a go. Moved by you, Chair? Yep, moved by me. By Councillor Darby or Hills
Me.
or somebody else? Okay, cool.
Okay.
On A.
Councillor Holt?
Aye.
Member Blair?
Aye.
Member Brown?
Aye.
Councillor Casey?
Aye.
Councillor Cooper?
Aye.
Councillor Darby?
4.
Mayor Goff?
Aye.
Councillor Hills?
Aye.
Councillor Newman?
No.
Councillor Sayers?
No.
Councillor Simpson?
Abstain.
Councillor Watson?
Yes.
Carried.
Okay, well done, team. And that was long, but it's, you know, it's an important one and important issues were raised. So let's move on.